Taegan is a PhD student working on this very difficult area of governance, and I think it was a very important thing to give a presentation about the challenges involved, because it's all very well to have a project, give people some matches, but it takes years and years to actually get the governance systems right to make it an effective project. So thank you, Taegan.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here today, next to the microphone. Thanks for your time, and great to be on Larrakia country. Larrakia so often host everybody to talk about other people in other places. And I really appreciate being here again to do just that. Andrew, thanks for uploading my... Great. Good one. Okay, I've been doing this study for about 5 years on the governance of Savannah fire management projects, working at the same time in the industry, so coming at it from a few different perspectives. And governance is a fairly broad term, but the definition I've settled on is this purposeful effort to steer or manage sectors of society in certain directions. And I've really been looking at the ground level of governance in the Savannah fire management programs. I'm making a few assumptions during this talk because I only have 15 minutes.
The people online. Sorry.
I'll keep talking.
Yeah.
The assumptions are that you understand the Savannah fire management method and how it works. There's operations on the ground, administration's often done remotely, and there's also the business component. Those are really important in terms of the governance of projects and where they plug into each other. And I'm also assuming that you understand that when I talk about socio-ecological systems in Australia, I am just looking at Aboriginal held land in the Northern Territory when I talk about Savannah fire management projects, which have distinctly different socio-ecological systems to your settler Australian setups on Savannah fire management projects. So all of the projects I'm discussing are on Aboriginal held land in the NT that have Aboriginal communities living and working on these Savannah fire management projects. So there are 5 critical factors to establish a project. One of them is tenure. I'm keeping it super simple in this talk because Aboriginal Land Rights Act of 1976 gave freehold tenure to traditional owners, and then carbon rights were assigned very clearly to that land tenure in the Carbon Farming Initiative Act of 2011. So it's a clear story for carbon rights, and that's not the case all over Australia, but it certainly makes this particular study a little bit easier. I'm assuming everybody in the room is in the business of the architecture of greenhouse gas accounting. So where the method sits, how it gets applied, where the accounting happens. So those 2 things I'm not really talking about much in this particular presentation. I'm mostly looking at access to and control of land, land managers to undertake the activities, and the capital to establish projects, and how those things have intersected and interacted on the ground. I've taken a mixed methods approach, doing 40 semi-structured interviews. 20 of those were with Arnhem Land leaders, so Alpha NT Board of Directors, and then I also had research agreements with Mimal, Wardakin and Southeast Arnhem Land Fire Abatement. I did a further 20 interviews with people in the broader industry, but I'm really focused on Arnhem Land and the NT for this particular talk. I've also gathered a bit of data using shapefiles from the Clean Energy Regulator website to generate some data from some of the projects in a way that allowed comparison. So I got all the shapefiles off the Clean Energy Regulator website and ran them through SAVBAT 2018 emissions avoidance so that everyone was kind of working off the same method to try and get some performance comparison. And I've also done a bit of observation working, administering some of that capital to establish SFM projects outside of Arnhem Land. So this is a few of the people that I interviewed from Arnhem Land Leadership Group. These are all Alpha NT directors. They're a very inspiring group of people with a very strong vision of the outcomes they're looking for from their projects. And they all spoke very cohesively about what their priorities are for their projects. Because it's a relatively global audience here today, I'm not going to dig too deep into some of the detail of those interviews. I'm going to talk about one of the major trends across the interviews, which was talking about the capacity to self-organise at a local level, where the relationship between landowners and land managers is strengthened. So just to clarify, land managers are Indigenous ranger groups. Sometimes they're landowners, sometimes they're not. Landowners are people who have cultural responsibilities to a particular estate. Sometimes they're rangers, often they're not, and sometimes they live in the project area and sometimes they live remotely. Nonetheless, they're a really critical part of the control and access to a project and making sure that the outcomes are how people want them to be. So land managers tend to do the annual cycle of projects, and that's where a lot of the annual benefits occur. Whereas landowners, in a lot of the Arnhem Land models, own the business, and that's where a lot of the long-term transformative benefits, so political and economic, cultural and social, are generated. So in the Northern Territory, of those 5 critical ingredients, we've got pretty easy access to and control of land. The land managers, all the ranger groups are set up, and fossil fuel offset arrangements have provided ample capital to establish projects both in Arnhem Land and outside. So I've sort of looked at, well, what's supporting or preventing self-organisation at project scale if you've got all of those basic requirements in place. And Eleanor Ostrom has been extremely helpful to me, who's a political scientist who won a Nobel Prize for Economics by looking at the use of shared resources, challenging Hardin's view that it's a tragedy of the commons, but more looking at how people arrange and organise themselves at scale to allow sustainable resource use. So in the Savannah fire management context, I'm looking at fire as your resource unit, Savannah landscape as the resource system, the governance system are all of the institutions administering Savannah fire, and the users are the landowners in this picture. Poor Eleanor, she's not looking complimentary there, but better there, great. She put out 10 variables that predict self-organisation within a socio-ecological system in 2009. And I'll separate those. She did note that across disciplines, it's very difficult to accumulate knowledge because your physical sciences and your social science are very rarely tying together in a way that allows those systems to make a lot of sense in an integrated manner. So I have also separated the social and ecological variables to try and look at how they fit in with this system. Of these ones here in the interview data that I had, all of these were very strong themes coming through from those Alpha NT directors, except for the number of users didn't really come up much. I've put all of those there because they already existed in the data, but the really pressing challenge for people at this stage are the collective choice rules. So people are finding it very difficult to self-organise at a scale that they find useful because of the collective choice rules that are currently in place. That was a standout theme in the data, and it's a conversation, I guess, within the institutional arrangements of the Northern Territory as to how people find the pathway to establish their own collective choice rules. Ecological variables, again, this is Ostrom putting out these 4 variables that can be used to predict self-organisation. I looked at these using that data from the Clean Energy Regulator website, and productivity of the system when put against community control was a significant outcome. with that data. So I allocated low, medium and high for community control across 14 projects. So this is Arnhem Land and broader across the NT. And there was a significant relationship there that the productivity of a system against baseline intensity. So for those scientists in the room, baseline across area was far more significant than just baseline. So this is a little bit like search effort or harvest density. How hard are people having to work to get ahead with their productivity was a significant outcome against community control, which I think is really significant in terms of a system that has ample capital, but people are relying on the capital that is theirs to spend in order to get self-organisation. So the main summary of outcomes here is that investing in social variables that support self-organisation to accelerate project maturity. I think there is clear fallout from Ostrom's theory, where if you have capital and you invest in those places, then you're supporting the emergence of self-organisation in projects. There's still a need for an alignment of institutions within the socio-technical regime to support projects to achieve maturity. So existing institutions aren't all facilitating pathways towards the self-organisation that people are looking for at project level. And the productivity of projects predicts for the emergence of self-organisation, which again can give some predictive value to which projects might need to consider aggregation in order to thrive, and which projects might be able to thrive independently, but also asks questions about how capital is currently being delivered if people are relying on the productivity of their projects in order to derive sufficient resources to assert their self-organisation. That's all I have to say for now. I have no idea of my timing, but if anyone has any questions, I'm open to them now or later. Hi, Sue. Do I'm not sure. That didn't take 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Yes, thanks, Taegan. You talked about the relationship between owners and managers being absolutely crucial. And so there's quite a lot of anthropology about that dynamic in Australian Indigenous societies. And I wondered whether you talk to people about how you draw on their own law and own rules and norms for resolving tensions that arise through that dynamic.
It came up in the interviews a lot. I didn't interrogate it because I'm not an anthropologist, but I asked a lot about how communication happened within projects and where decision-making happens in projects. And people were very clear about the relationship of traditional owners being primary in all of the projects and the need for rangers to be strongly linked to the people with customary responsibilities for that project to have permission to go ahead. And so it's sort of an internal issue of control and access to the project area, where the internal cultural dynamics were managed mostly by a title that has emerged that's senior rangers. And so it seems to be ranger coordinators are looking externally to deal with broader society demands. And then you've got this senior ranger role that tends to be someone with a lot of cultural knowledge. And they describe their role as constantly communicating with the right people in the right place to ensure that when the rangers do go somewhere and undertake their burning or their land management activities, they've got appropriate permission and the right person is going to that area. And they see that as a very important and fulfilling role, that senior ranger role, and critical to a project's success. Otherwise, the outcomes are not meaningful for people in terms of those cultural and social outcomes are not embedded with the same meaning if you haven't got that guidance.
From your experience, which is actually quite considerable in this space, because you've actually been looking at things for quite a time and been involved at the institutional level developing projects, what proportion of Savannah burning projects would you say have effective governance? When you look across the plethora of projects possible, how many of them are actually in a well-governed governance situation?
I didn't meet any groups who are entirely satisfied with the current frameworks for progressing decisions. So even those groups who are the most independent and have achieved the highest levels of self-organisation still encounter restrictions from the current institutional frameworks, mostly around control and access to land and permissions for enterprise development on land. But there's a vast chasm between those groups who can still see those barriers there and other groups that I've worked with that are still struggling to form any representative entity at all in order to voice an approach towards a project. So it really is quite a sliding scale in terms of that level of self-organisation. And I'd actually go back these social variables here in the people that I've interviewed that are the oldest Savannah fire management projects in existence, you know, moving from West Arnhem Land across to east. These people have been doing this for more than a decade now. They're very experienced, and all of these things are very clear in their stories of the development of their projects. The leadership and entrepreneurship, they all refer back to it. Norms and social capital, all of the Arnhem Land interviews consistently talked about the connections between groups and within groups and the understanding of what a project is delivering for people culturally, socially and economically. The mental model of Savannah fire management, as well as fire in the landscape from a cultural perspective, which is a different thing, the actual mental model of how Savannah fire management interacts was very well developed across all of the Alpha NT directors. And the importance of the resource has also, in the interviews, has two faces. It has the importance of the cultural delivery of landscape management and the importance of a discretionary fund where people can pursue their own interests was also independently threaded as a theme on the importance of the resource there. Whereas those things are absolutely the things that I haven't necessarily seen in other projects that have been established in the NT. Yeah.
Any other questions? One more. Oh, sorry, Jeremy. Out of my way.
Hello, my name is Akasio, ACACIO from Timor-Leste, and currently PhD student with the Charles Darwin University. Yes, for the socio-economic study is very important in order to, it's like incorporate with the indigenous local wisdom. Local wisdom is very important in case to intervene with a new project, or we would like to introduce new project. It's very good to know the local wisdom. So what is the method we're going to use in order to gathering data? Because sometimes in the case in Timor-Leste is government to put policy, but the policy is not reflect to the needs. It's local wisdom. So what's the best way we're going to collect the data? For East Timor case, we do not have reference. So probably the ground theory is probably appropriate, but the ground theory is like time consumption and requires a lot of, it's like data. So this one is not appropriate. So which one is better to gather in the data in terms for the local wisdom for the new project?
So I'm just going to check that I've got this. What's better, the government coming in with policy that often doesn't fit well at ground scale versus gathering data that's locally appropriate? Is that
Yes, it is.
more or less? Okay. So scale's a big part of this project. And even in those 5 critical components of the project, you know, your architecture is at a national scale in terms of your method delivery, and then your tenure tends to work on state jurisdictions. And then the control and access to land, the management of land is a far more local, locally based information. So how those things interact varies across projects as well. So priorities for one group are not going to be the same as priorities for another group. And certainly with the Savannah Fire Management projects across Arnhem Land, they've been very innovative in keeping centres of governance at project scale and then aggregating just certain parts of their business over the whole of Arnhem Land, so that you're able to have quite different priorities for different groups in those different places, even though the method itself is still the same from a policy perspective. How it is applied and local priorities are able to emerge.